Sam Bankman-Fried gets sentenced to 25 years. Hi, I'm Roger Royce. I'm a partner with Haynes Boone in Palo Alto, California. And of course, I have to comment on this for my 10,000 Startups podcast. This just came out yesterday. FTX co-founder Bankman-Fried sentenced to 25 years in prison. He said he was sorry about what happened at every stage, but the federal judge sentenced him to 25 years. He also ordered him to make restitution. I mean, he'll be over 50 when he gets out if he spends the whole time. But the judge was, nobody, that's how you know it was a good settlement, because no one was happy, because Bankman-Fried said, 6.5 years sounds about right. And the prosecutor said he ought to get 50. And I guess the judge split the difference. He was, interestingly, he was influenced by the fact he said Bankman-Fried wasn't really remorseful. He also did not like his actions during the trial, that he wasn't completely forthcoming. His testimony was a disaster. Everybody agrees on that. And he'd been accused of tampering with witnesses. But interestingly, he said, there's a risk this man will be in a position to do something very bad in the future, and it's not a trivial risk at all. Which is not what you want to hear if you're trying to convince somebody that you're truly remorseful and sorry and you wish you hadn't done it. No parole in the federal system, but he could get released earlier for good behavior, I understand. But that's not what I really want to focus on here. What I want to focus on is more of the startup component of this. And the thing is as I watched this, one of the arguments he made is that, look, these people weren't really hurt, and it was just a matter of bad timing because, everything just happened because of the dip in the crypto markets. And if it hadn't dipped, none of this ever would have happened. That argument did not help him because all it told the judge is that, all you're saying is you might not have been caught for your wrongdoing. And that's one way of looking at it. But I got to tell you, in startup land where I live, there's a lot of that fake it till you make it stuff going on. People have what we call a suspension of reality. They have grandiose dreams. They expect to be the biggest thing in the world. They expect so much so that they will gamble everything on it, which is what Sam Bankman-Fried did. He gambled everything on the belief that this is all going to work out. Remember what happened here. Money came in to the company. FTX came in through the front door, went out the back door, basically. That was the allegation anyway. Money came in from customer deposits, then was somehow transferred via loan or whatever to Alameda Research, and then reinvested in the FTX token. So that was the fraud. So here's the thing about that. What I notice in this is kind of this attitude that I see over this incredible hubris. And it's a double-edged sword, because I feel like a startup founder has to have that. They have to have that incredible confidence, right? Like Elon Musk has to believe his rockets are going to go to Mars before he could even start on a project like that. They have to have that incredible confidence in the face of contrary evidence, and they have to be huge risk takers going into it, or they would never start a company and do what they were doing. So you see that a lot. And so I'm sure he believed that everything was going to work out fine. I'm sure Liz Holmes believed that as well. I'm sure that the Nikola founder believed that. I'm sure that all these guys that got in trouble believed that everything was going to work out fine at some point, so much so that they did not see the harm of what they're doing. Well, and that's where startup founders get into trouble, because they end up getting nailed for fraud. And Sam Bankman-Fried's case is if you can't be a good example, be a horrible warning, I suppose. And that is a horrible warning, because that went as bad as it could go. It turned out being criminal fraud. Well, there's also securities fraud, and there's common law fraud. I think you got to go pretty far to cross that criminal fraud threshold. And I'm not a criminal lawyer, and I don't advise people on that. I do advise people, though, that not to commit common law or securities fraud. So common law fraud, let me just reiterate this for you so you know as a founder, what to do so you don't get in Sam Bankman-Fried trouble. Generally, depending on the court and the state, they phrase the elements a little bit differently, but I like this 9-part test because it's a little more detailed. 9 elements to commit a fraud, a common law fraud. And common law just means it's not by, well, it could be by statute now, but it's case law generated. Number 1, a representation of fact. Number 2, that is false. 3, that's material, not something insignificant. 4, this is the big one, knowledge of the falsity, right? You have to know that it's false. That's where it's kind of hard to get people typically. An intent that it be acted on. You're telling somebody this because you're trying to get them to do something. The injured party doesn't know that it's false. The injured party, in fact, does rely on the representation, and they have a right to rely on that representation. And finally, they're injured somehow because of that. Those are the 9 elements. Now, different courts are a little bit different, and they'll expand or contract them. For example, there can also be negligent misrepresentations, so you don't have to have that intent to deceive. There can be innocent representations, but all of them will apply only to statements of fact. Now, before we talk about how to make sure this isn't you, I just want to mention securities fraud is different. Those are several different causes of action. First of all, they generally come up in the case of the sale of a security. So you're not even in securities fraud land until that happens. But securities are very broadly defined. It's especially these days under our current SEC. So that standard, if we have a sale of security under the statute, prohibits a scheme or artifice to fraud, false statements of fact or omissions that make truthful statements misleading, and acts or practices that operate as frauds or deceits. That can be brought by private investors, the SEC, and other parties, even the Department of Justice. So, okay, getting back to what you should do now, because sometimes people, when I tell them about these cases and this stuff, they say to me, well, how do I avoid, being prosecuted for fraud? And my usual answer is, don't commit fraud. Okay, well, that sort of begs the question, well, what do we do so I don't have to? Well, the number one thing here is, let me give you 3 rules. My number 1 rule, just never fudge a fact, right? Never make up a number or lie about having a customer. And where this comes up and gets a little blurry is you might have talked with your startup, you might have gotten in the door and talked with every potential customer in the valley, but nobody signed that purchase order yet. So you go tell your investor that, oh yeah, we got sales all over, we got purchase orders. Well, you don't, right? What you do is you've had expressions of interest, so be careful about that. Okay. Related to that, a lot of times companies will go out and get their product in the market, but they won't have a paying customer. I would advise you to be super clear about that. Someone says, gee, do you have users? Yeah, we have users, but they're not paying. I would volunteer that, even if your angel isn't smart enough to ask you for it, because you don't want them claiming you told them something different down the road. So just don't fudge facts. Be just squeaky clean about facts. The second, now that's different than puffing, right? We have, a dozen purchase orders is way different than saying, oh, we're totally going to get a dozen purchase orders sometime in the future. We're so awesome. All right. One's an opinion, one's a fact. Very different. They result in very different legal consequences. Secondly, here's something to keep in mind when you go out and talk to investors, because that's where this always comes up in connection with investors. If you'd rather they don't know about it, it's probably material. If you'd rather they don't know about it, you should probably tell them about it. And it's an odd rule. Where this comes up, sometimes people say, oh, gee, I got this criminal record. I don't want my investor to know about it. Oh, well, why not? Well, because then they won't invest. Well, you just told me it's material. I think you better tell them. Plus, they're going to find out anyway if they're a smart investor. And then thirdly, don't omit any material facts. And because fraud can be a crime of omission, not a crime, but I guess a civil tort of omission, if, remember my 9 factors here, if, oh, where is it? Yeah, here it is. If you fail to state a fact, that would make a representation, misleading. You know what I mean? So for in other words, my example where you represent it, you've got customers all over the valley, but you haven't told them that, oh gee, but they're not paying for the product. I'm not saying here in public whether that is fraud or not, or whether that's an actionable omission. I'm just saying I'd rather not have to litigate that issue. So don't do that. When in doubt, disclose. And my rule on this is that if you end up having to argue over that in court, then you've already lost, because you're going to have to be paying a litigator. If you think I'm expensive, wait till you talk to those guys. Talk is cheap till you talk to a lawyer, they say. So, and then finally, I know I was going to give you 3 things, but I'm going to give you one more for free. Just be transparent, communicate, don't hold back, overwhelm people with information. Angels are going to know that you're just wildly optimistic and willing to suspend reality. They'll get that. They probably don't believe anything you're telling them anyway, but they're not going to think that you're an evil or person or that you've got a bad intent. If you're really just giving them lots of information, they're more likely to think something's bad if you're being pretty closed mouth about it. Okay, Roger Royce, Haynes Boone, and stay tuned for our next episode of 10,000 Startups. Thanks.